folder is already open on my kitchen table. On the edge, a Blayek sits across from me, 43 years old, and he does not take the coffee I made. He slides a photocopied page across the table. My handwriting, 2 paragraphs, March 1978. I remember the telephone number I dialed that evening, the way I kept my voice steady reading from my notes. He says, I just need to know if you remember writing this. He does not raise his voice. He does not need to. I look at the page. I do not look at him. He asks if I will sign a statement saying I never reported him. I cannot. I remember the cold in our flat on Segel Street. Not the kind you can fix with another blanket. The kind that came through the walls themselves, through the plaster that sweated in winter and left dark patches shaped like continents. I slept in the room with my sister, and in the mornings our breath hung in the air like smoke. My mother would light the stove at 5, and the sound of coal shifting in the grate was the first thing I knew each day. My name is Marta Voskova. I was born on the 4th of March 1951 in Brno, the second child of a railway engineer and a seamstress. My father worked for the state railway inspecting tracks on the line to Prague. My mother sewed dresses for women who could afford new fabric, which was not many. We had 2 rooms and a kitchen, and the toilet was on the landing shared with 3 other families. The stairwell smelled of coal smoke and boiled cabbage. I know that is what everyone says, but it is also what I smelled every day for 18 years. My earliest clear memory is from 1956. I was 5. My father came home from work and did not take off his coat. He sat at the kitchen table and turned on the big valve radio, the one with the wooden cabinet that took up half the sideboard, and he pressed his ear so close to the speaker that the plastic touched his skin. My mother stood in the doorway with a dish towel in her hands, not drying anything, just holding it. Neither of them spoke. I was in the corner with my brother, building something with wooden blocks, and I knew without being told that I was not supposed to ask what he was listening to. Later, I understood it was news from Hungary. But at 5, what I understood was this: there were things my father needed to hear that he could not say out loud, and there were things my mother knew that she would not ask about, and the radio was the place where those 2 silences met. That was the year I learned to read. Not at school, my mother taught me using the one book we had that was not a dictionary or an atlas. It was a volume of fairy tales, the kind where the princess is saved by a brave young man and the witch is burned in her own oven. I read it so many times the spine cracked, but the bookshelf itself was mostly empty. There was the atlas, with its maps of a Europe that no longer existed, borders that had been redrawn, countries that had been swallowed. There was a Czech-Russian dictionary, thick and gray, which my father never opened, and there was the fairy tales. That was all. Because in 1948, the year before I was born, my father had carried the rest of the books down to the courtyard and burned them. I did not know this until I was older. I asked him once what they had been, and he said, "Just books." He did not say what kind, and I did not ask again. We were not dissidents. We were not party loyalists. We were not anything that had a name. We were people who had learned to take up as little space as possible. My father went to work, came home, read the newspaper, Rude Bravo, which everyone read because it was the only one, and did not talk about politics. My mother went to the shops, stood in queues, sewed, cooked, and did not complain. They had learned in 1948 and then again in the years after that the safest way to exist was to be invisible. And I absorbed that lesson before I could read. I knew by the time I was 6 that you did not raise your voice. You did not ask questions that started with why. You did not draw attention to your family, your opinions, your books, or your radio. You kept your head down and your voice low, especially after 9 o'clock when the walls were thin and the neighbors were listening. I remember the year my father stopped speaking at dinner. That was 1956. He never explained why. But I knew, even then, that something had broken in him. He had listened to the radio, and whatever he heard had changed the way he sat at the table, the way he held his fork, the way he looked at my mother when she asked him a question. He did not tell us what it was. He did not tell us that the Soviet tanks had rolled into Budapest, that the Hungarians had risen and been crushed, that the same thing could happen here and that the party would not hesitate. He told us nothing, but he stopped speaking at dinner, and that told me everything. I was 5 years old, and I already understood that silence was a language, that the things you did not say were the things that mattered most, that the safest place in our flat was not the room with the door, it was the space between what you thought and what you allowed your face to show. I learned that before I learned to multiply, before I learned the capital of the Soviet Union, before I learned that there were words you could write in a private notebook that would get your father arrested if they were found. I learned it at the kitchen table, watching my mother stand in the doorway with a dish towel in her hands, not moving, while my father listened to the radio with his ear pressed to the speaker, and neither of them said a word. And that is where I begin, not with a date or a declaration, with a kitchen, a radio, and a silence that lasted through dinner and through the years that followed. I am 66 years old now, and I have spent most of my life inside that silence. I taught mathematics for 37 years in the schools of this city. I taught children how to solve equations, how to prove theorems, how to think in straight lines. And I never told them what I had learned at the kitchen table when I was 5, that the real lesson, The one that mattered was not in the curriculum. It was in the way we learned to hold our tongues. I am telling you this now because I have decided that carrying it quietly until I die is also a kind of cowardice. And I have had enough of those. But before I tell you what I did, before I tell you about the boy named Ondej and the report I wrote, and the telephone number on the card with no letterhead, I need you to understand the world I grew up in. The school on Kounicova Street, where I started in 1957. Portrait above the blackboard that changed faces but never changed frames. The day my classmate Tomang brought a Western comic book to school and what happened to him for it. That is where the story really begins, not in a kitchen, in a classroom. I remember the first day of school, September 1957. My mother had sewn my uniform herself, a dark blue pinafore with a white collar, the fabric stiff and new. She braided my hair so tight it pulled at my temples. The school on Kounicova Street was a building from the 1890s, tall windows, a stone staircase worn hollow in the middle from generations of feet. We lined up in the courtyard, 70 of us, and a teacher walked down the line checking our fingernails and the condition of our shoes. Then we were marched inside and I saw the portrait for the first time. Clement Gottwald, our first communist president, a round face under a worker's cap, staring down from a plain wooden frame above the blackboard. I did not know who he was. I only knew that we were not to look away from him when the teacher spoke. The desks were bolted down. I did not notice that at first, but I noticed later when I tried to move mine an inch to see the board better and it would not shift. Everything in that room was fixed in place. The desks, the seats, the order of the alphabet on the roll call, the portrait above the board. The portrait changed over the years. Gottwald died in 1953, but his picture stayed until 1962 when they replaced it with Novotny. Then Novotny fell and they put up Husak. The frames never changed, only the faces inside them. And no one ever said, "Look, the picture is different now." We just looked at the new face and did not mention the old one. We learned reading and writing first, then arithmetic, then from the 3rd grade Russian, not offered, required. I remember the first Russian textbook, a blue cover with a picture of the Kremlin, the letters strange and beautiful. Our teacher, Mrs. Prochaskova, was a thin woman with a voice like a ruler tapping a desk. She taught us to say, "Zdravstvuyte and Kakedela and ya lublю Sovetski Soyuz." I love the sound of it, the roll of the R, the way the words felt in my mouth. I did not understand then that I was being taught to love a country I had never seen. I only knew that I was good at it and that Mrs. S. Prochaskova smiled at me when I recited correctly, and that smile was a small warm thing in a room of fixed positions. From the 5th grade, we had something called civic education. Mrs. Prochaskova taught that too. She would stand at the front of the class and explain the history of the party, the friendship with the Soviet Union, the enemies of socialism who lurked beyond our borders. She did not raise her voice. She spoke as if she were describing the weather. The imperialist West, she would say, wants to destroy our way of life. They send their comics and their music and their ideas to weaken the minds of young socialists. And we would nod, because everyone nodded, because the desks were bolted down and so were we. I remember the day Tomanki brought a comic book to school. His name was Tomang Horak, a quiet boy with a cowlick that never lay flat. The comic was American. I think it came through an uncle in Vienna. I saw it only for a moment under his desk during the break between arithmetic and Russian. The colors were so bright they hurt my eyes. A man in a red cape, a woman with yellow hair, buildings on fire. I had never seen anything like it. The paper was glossy, not like the rough gray paper of our textbooks. It smelled different too, chemical and sweet. Mrs. Prochaskova saw it. She walked down the aisle, her shoes silent on the wooden floor, and she took it from his hands without a word. Thomas did not resist. He let it go. She held it up by one corner as if it were something contaminated, and she said, "Thomas, stand at the front." He stood. She turned to the rest of us and explained in that same calm weather voice that Western culture was designed to weaken the minds of young socialists, that comics like this one were a weapon, that Tomanki had been careless, but we could learn from his mistake. Kumach stared at the floor. None of us looked at him. I looked at my desk, at the grain of the wood, at the inkwell set into the corner. I did not look at him. I have thought about that many times since. I did not look at him. But I want to be honest with you, because that is why I am here. The system gave me things I valued, real things. Free school meals, a bowl of soup at lunch, a piece of bread with margarine, a glass of milk. I was never hungry at school. Free textbooks, passed down from year to year, their covers worn soft, but the mathematics inside was sound. And the structure, the day began at 8, ended at 3, every hour accounted for. After my father stopped speaking at dinner, after the radio pressed against his ear in 1956, after the silences that filled our flat like smoke, school was a place where I knew what would happen next. That mattered to me. It mattered more than I can explain without sounding as if I am defending what I should not defend. I am not defending it. I am telling you what it felt like from inside. The safety was real. The soup was warm. The mathematics was rigorous. And I became a teacher because I believed genuinely, that I could give children what I had been given, a structured day, a subject that made sense, a small patch of order in a world that was, even then, beginning to crack. I started teaching at the school on Kounicova Street in 1973. Same building, same bolted down desks. The portrait above the board was Husak by then. I stood where Mrs. Czechoslovakia had stood, and I taught fractions and algebra and proof-based geometry, and I loved it. I loved the moment when a student's face changed, when the numbers clicked into place and they understood that was real. That was mine, but the other thing was also real. The thing I have not said yet, the thing I will have to say. In November 1977, a man came to my classroom after the students had left. He was not a teacher. He wore a gray suit that did not fit well, and he carried a leather briefcase. He introduced himself as Comrade Novak from the district office. He sat in the front row in the desk where Tomank had sat 20 years before, and he asked me in a tone that was entirely conversational about one of my students, a boy named Ondej. He asked me to let him know if Ondej said anything at school about his father's activities. About Charter 77, about foreign radio, about anything that seemed politically unhealthy. He left me a telephone number written on a plain card with no letterhead. I took the card, I put it in my desk drawer, and I did not say no. I remember the room, not the whole school, just that room. The examination hall on Kounicova Street, where they sat us at individual desks spaced 2 meters apart so no one could see another's paper. The windows were tall, the glass painted over halfway up so we couldn't look outside. I don't know why that detail stayed. Maybe because it was the first time I understood that the test was not just about what I knew. 2 days. Mathematics, Czech, Russian, sciences. I finished each paper early and checked my answers twice. I was good at tests. I had learned that the correct answer was a safe place to live. Then came the interview. A committee of 3, my head teacher, a woman from the district education office, and a man I had never seen before. He was introduced as Comrade Horak from the local party committee. He wore a gray suit that did not fit well at the collar. He asked me questions about my favorite subjects, about what I wanted to be. I said a teacher, and then he leaned forward and said, "And what does your father do, Marta?" I told him. "Railway engineer." He nodded. Then, "Does your family listen to foreign radio stations?" I said no. I was not sure if this was true. My father sometimes turned the dial very low at night, but I knew the right answer was no. He wrote something on his clipboard. I did not look at what he wrote. I was tracked to gymnasium, academic stream, university preparation. I was 14 years old, and I understood even then that my test scores were part of it, but not all of it. The year before, my father had quietly joined the local trade union committee. He never explained why, he never talked about it. But I knew Renata. She sat 2 rows behind me in primary school. She was faster at mathematics than I was. She finished problems before I had copied them down. On the 2-day examination, she scored higher than me in mathematics. I saw the results posted on the board. I remember her score. I remember mine. Her father had been an engineer. After 1968, he was called to a meeting and asked to sign a document condemning the Prague Spring. He refused. He was dismissed from his post within a month. He found work as a night watchman at a warehouse. Renata was tracked to a textile vocational school. She spent the next 30 years operating looms. I say this slowly because I am still measuring it. At 14, I told myself the system was rational. Cause determine outcomes. Renata's case was an exception, a mistake, something that happened because of circumstances I did not fully understand. I needed to believe this because the alternative was that I had benefited from someone else's punishment. And I was not ready to know that about myself. I walked to gymnasium every morning past the textile factory where Renata had started her training. Sometimes I saw her at the bus stop. We did not talk about what had happened. We talked about nothing. We stood side by side and said nothing, and I told myself it was awkwardness, not guilt. I am not sure when I stopped believing the lie. It did not happen all at once. It happened in pieces. A colleague mentioning that her son had been rejected from university despite top marks. A newspaper article about the children of former party officials who had all somehow become doctors and lawyers. A conversation with my father years later when he said, "I joined the committee so you would have a chance," and I realized he had known all along. I was 14. I did not design the system. I did not choose to benefit from it, but I did benefit. And I told myself it was fair. What I understand now is this: the examination tested knowledge, the interview tested obedience. And I passed both. I passed because I was smart enough to answer the mathematics questions and smart enough to say no when they asked about the radio. I passed because my father had made a calculation I did not understand at the time. Renata passed the mathematics test. She failed the interview. She failed because her father had refused to sign a piece of paper, and that was the system. It was not a mistake. It was not an exception. It was the point. I have thought about this for 30 years. I have thought about what I would say to Renata if I saw her again. I have not seen her. I do not know if she is alive. I do not know if she would want to hear from me. I am telling you this now because I have stopped telling myself the comfortable version. The comfortable version is that I was a child, that I had no power, that the system was too large for any one person to change. All of that is true, and none of it changes what happened. I became a teacher. I taught mathematics. I taught the children who passed the examination and the children who did not. I taught them the same equations, the same proofs. I told myself that was enough, but I never told them what I knew about the system that had sorted them. I never told them about Renata. I never told them about the man with the clipboard and the question about the radio. I am telling you now. I arrived at the pedagogical faculty in Brno in September 1969, a year after the tanks. The building on Poshiki Street still had a crack in the stonework from a bullet that had been fired during the invasion. No one had repaired it and no one mentioned it. I was 18 years old, carrying a suitcase my mother had packed with 2 skirts, 3 blouses, and a copy of the mathematical theory of probability I had bought with money I did not have. I thought I was becoming a teacher. I did not yet understand that the university was being taken apart around me. The first semester, I had a professor named Dr. Karel Fanda. He taught differential calculus. He was a thin man with a slight stammer who wrote proofs on the blackboard with his left hand, and when he reached a difficult step, he would pause and tap the chalk against his teeth until he found the words. I loved his lectures. In November, he did not appear for a week. Then another man came in, younger, who introduced himself as Dr. Just, himself as Dr. Borak, and said he would be taking over the course. The syllabus was the same, the textbook was the same, but the proofs were written differently, faster, cleaner, without the pauses. I never saw Dr. Banda again. Someone told me his office had been cleaned out over a weekend. I did not ask who had done it. The ideological courses were mandatory. 4 hours a week, Marxist-Leninist theory, the history of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, scientific atheism. They were graded. A failing grade meant expulsion. I remember the textbook for the atheism course. A thick volume with a blue cover, the pages already yellowed from the cheap paper. It described religion as a tool of the bourgeoisie, a superstition that had no place in a scientific society. I read it carefully. I underlined passages. I memorized the arguments. And when I wrote my examinations, I produced exactly what was expected. Clear, structured, ideologically correct answers, citing the appropriate authorities, using the approved vocabulary. I did not believe a word of it. But I learned to write as if I did. I learned to separate what I thought from what I put on paper. I learned to keep a part of myself entirely silent behind a door I never opened, not even in my own mind. I passed every course. I passed with distinction, and I told myself that this was survival, not betrayal. I told myself that I was doing what I had to do to become a teacher. I told myself that mathematics was pure, that it could not be corrupted, that it would still be mathematics when I stood in front of a classroom. In my third year, my faculty advisor, a woman named Dr. Tur, B. Ira, Na, who taught geometry and who I later learned had been dismissed from a research institute after 1968, called me into her office. She closed the door. She said quietly that I should consider joining the Czechoslovak Socialist Youth Union, the USM. She said it was not a requirement, but that students without party affiliation sometimes found it difficult to secure teaching posts in state schools. She said it in the same tone she used to explain a theorem, matter of fact, without emphasis, as if she were stating a condition of the problem. I joined. I filled out the form. I attended 2 meetings. I paid the dues. I did not speak at the meetings. I told myself it was a formality, a piece of paper, it meant nothing. I told myself that I was not becoming anything I could not undo later. I told myself that the mathematics was what mattered, that the classroom was where I belonged, that the rest was just noise I had to tolerate to get there. But I remember the weight of that form in my hand. I remember the pen I used to sign it, a blue ballpoint with a cracked barrel that leaked ink onto my fingers. I remember thinking, as I wrote my name, that I was doing something I would have to explain someday. And then I pushed that thought aside and signed. In 1973, I received my teaching assignment. A secondary school on Masarykova Street in Brno, mathematics, grades 6 through 9. A good posting, I was told, better than a village school, better than a factory training center. It was in the city where I had grown up. It was a school with a reputation for academic rigor. The principal, a man named František Koval, shook my hand and said I was fortunate. He said the party had approved my placement because my record was clean and my ideological coursework had been exemplary. He said he expected me to maintain that standard. I stood in the empty classroom on my first day. The desks were arranged in 5 rows of 6. The chalkboard was clean. The morning light came through the tall windows and fell across the floor in rectangles. I touched the chalk tray. I picked up a piece of chalk. I felt something I had not expected to feel. Pride. I had done it. I had passed the examinations. I had joined the union. I had written the required answers. I had kept my head down and my mouth closed, and I had earned this room, these windows, this light. And I felt ashamed of that pride. I felt it in my stomach, a cold knot that did not loosen. Because I knew, even then, that the room had been given to me on terms I had accepted without saying yes. I had said yes, by silence, by compliance, by signing a form with a cracked pen. I had said yes by not saying no. I went anyway. I walked to the front of the classroom. I wrote my name on the board. I turned to face the empty desks, and I began to teach. I remember the first time I held a new syllabus, 1973, my first year teaching. It arrived bound in gray paper, 63 pages, and it told me exactly what to teach on every single Tuesday for the next 5 years. The ministry in Prague had decided that on the third Tuesday of October, my students would learn the factorization of quadratic expressions. And they did, because that was what the syllabus said, and I followed it. I taught mathematics, real mathematics, fractions in the 5th grade, algebra in the 6th, geometry with proofs in the 7th. The curriculum was rigorous. I say that without apology. I have seen textbooks from the West since 1989, and some of them are softer. They assume children cannot handle difficulty. Our system assumed they could, and they did. I love that about it. I still love it, but the word problems, I read them aloud for years without thinking. A collective farm produces 340 tons of wheat. After fulfilling the state quota of 280 tons, what percentage remains for local distribution? The mathematics was correct. The context was mandatory. I did not pause. I did not change the numbers. I did not say, this is a political problem dressed as mathematics. I just read it every year for 12 years. And I find that more disturbing now than if I had read it with conviction, because conviction would have meant I believed it. Reading it without pause meant I had stopped noticing. Deviation required written justification. You wanted to teach logarithms in October instead of November? You wrote a letter to the district school inspector explaining why. You wanted to use a supplementary textbook? You submitted it for approval. Most of us did not deviate, not because we were afraid, because it was easier to follow the plan. The plan was good. The plan was safe. The plan meant no one asked questions. I remember a parent-teacher evening, 1976. Father came. He was a factory foreman. His son was in my class, a boy named Pavel, good at mathematics but not exceptional. The father said to me, "Why is my son learning calculus? He is going to be a machinist. He needs to read a blueprint, not solve an integral." I told him the curriculum was set by the ministry. I did not set it. This was true. I told him a strong mathematical foundation served every career. This I believed. I did not tell him that Pavel's test score suggested he could do far more than operate a lathe if the system allowed it. I did not tell him that his son had a gift for abstraction that would be wasted on a factory floor. I told him what was safe. I told him what was true enough. I did not tell him the whole truth. I told myself I was not lying. I was not. I was choosing what to say. I was protecting myself. I was protecting Pavel. I was protecting the system that had given me a job and a salary and a pension. I was protecting the mathematics. I told myself the mathematics was what mattered. The word problems were decoration. The curriculum was a container. What was inside was real. but the container shaped what was inside. I know that now. The system did not just teach mathematics. It taught that the collective farm was the natural unit of production. It taught that the state quota was a given, not a choice. It taught that the percentage remaining for local distribution was a calculation, not a political question, and I taught that. I taught it by reading the words aloud. I taught it by not commenting. I taught it by treating the problem as neutral. I think about that father sometimes. He knew his son's place in the system. He accepted it. He was not angry at me. He was trying to understand why his son needed to know something his son would never use, and I did not tell him the truth. I did not say, "Your son is smarter than you think, and the system will not let him be where he could be." I did not say, "I am teaching him calculus because the ministry says so, and because I love it, and because I cannot tell you what I really think." I taught mathematics for 27 years. I taught it well. I taught it with passion. I taught it to children who would become engineers and scientists and teachers and factory workers and electricians. I gave them what I could, but I also taught them every day that the system was normal, that the world problems were normal, that the absence of choice was normal. I taught them that the world was a set of given conditions and the task was to calculate the result. And I never told anyone what I really thought, not my husband, not my colleagues, not my students. I told myself it was survival. It was, but survival has a cost. The cost is that you become the person who reads the word problem without pausing. You become the person who does not tell the father the truth. You become the person who knows the system is wrong and keeps working inside it. I am still that person. I am sitting here telling you this, and I am still the person who read the word problem without pausing. I am the person who did not tell the father. I am the person who taught calculus to a boy who could have been a mathematician and let him become a machinist. I am the person who did not say a word. I do not know how to end this. I do not know what I want you to understand. I only know that I taught mathematics. I taught it well. And I taught it inside a system that asked me to become someone I did not want to be. And I became her anyway. And she is still here. I remember the first time Ondej raised his hand in my class. It was October 1976, a Tuesday I think. The light was that thin autumn gold that comes through the east windows in the afternoon. I had written a quadratic equation on the board, nothing unusual, something from the standard textbook, and I had barely finished the second line when I saw his hand go up. Not waving, just raised, elbow on the desk, fingers relaxed. He was 14. He had been in my class for 6 weeks. I asked him what he wanted. He said, very politely, that my equation was correct, but that there was a second solution I hadn't mentioned, and he explained it in 3 sentences, using terms I hadn't taught yet. I looked at him for a moment. Then I turned back to the board and wrote what he had said, exactly as he had said it, and I felt something I had not expected, a small private pleasure, like finding a book you have forgotten you owned. He was the kind of student you meet once, maybe twice, in 30 years of teaching. He didn't just solve problems, he saw the shape of them, the way a mathematician sees a proof before he writes it. He would finish an exercise and then sit there, staring at the ceiling, working through the next one in his head. I used to give him extra problems, things I found in old university texts, just to watch him think. He never asked for help. He never needed it. His father was Dr. Pavel Blayek. I knew the name before I knew the son. He was a historian at the university, a specialist in the interwar period, and in January 1977 he had signed Charter 77, one of the first signatures in Brno. I read about it in the party newspaper, which reported it as a betrayal, a collaboration with Western intelligence. I did not know then what it meant for a man to sign that document. I found out later, by the autumn of 1970s. Dr. Blayek had been dismissed from the university. No pension, no severance, no explanation beyond a letter stating that his position had been abolished due to restructuring. He found work as a boiler room attendant at the city hospital. Ondej told me this one afternoon when he stayed after class to ask about a geometry problem. He said it without complaint, as if it were simply a fact about the world, like the fact that winter followed autumn. His mother had stopped speaking to the neighbors. His younger sister had been denied admission to the school orchestra. I listened. I nodded. I said I was sorry, and I meant it. In November of that year, a man came to see me. He arrived after the last bell, when the corridors were empty and the cleaning staff had not yet started. The school secretary brought him to my classroom and said, "Comrade Novak from the district office." He was in his 40s, I think, with a face that was easy to forget, ordinary features, ordinary clothes, a gray suit that could have belonged to anyone. He sat in the chair across from my desk and smiled. He said he understood I was a dedicated teacher. He said he knew I had joined the USM as a student and that my ideological assessments were in order. He said he had heard good things about my mathematics classes. And then he leaned forward slightly and asked, in the same conversational tone, whether I had noticed anything unusual about Ondej Blayek. I said he was a gifted student. "Yes," Comrade Novak said, "gifted." "And his father? Well, you know about his father." I said I did. He nodded. He said that in times like this, it was important for teachers to be vigilant. that the party relied on people like me, people who understood that the health of the society depended on catching problems early, that he was not asking me to do anything difficult. Just to let him know if Ondej said anything at school about his father's activities, about Charter 77, about foreign radio, about anything that seemed, he paused here, searching for the word, politically unhealthy. He took a card from his jacket pocket. Plain white, no letterhead, no logo, just a telephone number written in blue ballpoint. He placed it on my desk between us and stood up. "You can reach me at this number," he said, "anytime, evenings, weekends." He shook my hand and left. I kept the card. I tell you this now, directly, because I have spent 20 years wondering what I would say if I ever said it aloud. I kept the card. I put it in the drawer of my nightstand under a stack of handkerchiefs. I did not throw it away. I did not report the visit to anyone. I did not tell my husband. I did not tell Ondej. I kept it. And for the next 4 months, I did nothing with it. I told myself that was enough. That by not using the number, I had made a choice. That silence was a form of refusal. That I was not the kind of person who did what Comrade Novak had asked, but I had not thrown the card away. And that, I think now, was the moment I began to become someone I did not want to recognize. Not when I made the call. That came later. That was just the consequence. The real decision was the one I made in that empty classroom, when I picked up the card and put it in my pocket instead of tearing it in half and dropping the pieces into the wastebasket under my desk. I told myself I was keeping it out of caution, that if I refused openly, there would be consequences, that I had a career, that I had a husband, that I was not responsible for the sins of the state. I told myself all of this, and I believed it because it was easier than believing the truth. The truth was that I was afraid. And that fear made me complicit before I had done anything. I kept the card for 4 months. And then, in March of 1978, I used it. I remember the exact weight of the telephone receiver. Not the plastic. The Bakelite handset my parents had kept since the 1950s. The one with the frayed cord and the faint crackle in the earpiece. It was heavier than it looked. I held it in my right hand and the piece of paper in my left, and I read the words I had written 2 hours earlier after Ondej had gone home. I dialed the number from the card. It rang 3 times. A man answered, "Not Comrade Novak, someone younger with a voice that sounded bored." I gave him the code from the card. He said, "Go ahead," so I read. The student Ondej Blanjek, age 15, remained after class today to ask about a geometry problem involving the calculation of volume for a truncated pyramid. During the conversation, he mentioned that his father, Dr. Teryu, Abel Blayek, had received another visit from men identifying themselves as being from Prague. He said the family was considering applying for permission to emigrate. I kept my voice steady. I had practiced in my head on the walk home. I had timed it so I would not pause in the wrong places, so I would not sound uncertain. I read the second paragraph, which was shorter, just the boy's schedule, the times he was in my classroom, nothing more, and then I stopped. The man said, "Thank you," and hung up. I put the receiver back on the cradle. I folded the paper and put it in the kitchen drawer under the tea towels. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself that the StB already knew everything about the Blayek family. They had a file on Dr. Blayek. From the moment he signed Charter 77, they had people watching his building. They probably had someone in the hospital where he worked. What I had added was nothing they did not already have. A boy's casual words after class, a geometry problem, a mention of emigration that anyone in the family's position would have been discussing. I told myself Ondej had told me freely. He had not said, "This is a secret." He had not asked me not to repeat it. He was a 15-year-old boy talking to his mathematics teacher about his father's troubles, and I was a teacher, and teachers were supposed to report things that might affect a student's welfare. That was what I told myself. I told myself I was not an informant in any meaningful sense because I had only done it once and I would never do it again. I recited these justifications to myself for years. I can still recite them now. They are like a prayer I memorized in a language I no longer speak. It was nothing. They already knew. He told me freely. I only did it once. I say them in the same flat voice I used to read the report over the telephone, because that is how I learned to say them, without inflection, without the crack that would let the other thing through. In 1979, Ondej sat the university entrance examination. He scored in the top 3% in the entire country in mathematics. I saw the results. The school received a list of the top scorers from the district, and his name was on it. I remember thinking, good, he will have his choice of programs. He wanted to study mathematics at Charles University in Prague, or physics at Brno, or computer science, a new program at the Technical University. He had told me all of this, his voice quick with excitement, the year before. He was rejected from every university program he applied to, every single one. The official reason, typed on a form and sent to his parents, was insufficient civic profile. That was the phrase. Insufficient civic profile. It meant the son of a Charter 77 signatory could not be permitted to study mathematics at a university in Czechoslovakia, no matter how well he had scored on the examination. He was assigned to a vocational program in electrical maintenance at a technical school in Brno. He spent his 20s rewiring factory floors. I know this because I asked about him years later from a colleague who had kept in touch with his mother. I did not connect my report to his rejection at the time, or I told myself I did not. I told myself that the StB had their own sources, their own methods, that my 2 paragraphs were irrelevant, that the decision to block his university admission had been made long before I picked up the telephone, that my report changed nothing. I told myself this for 17 years. I am not sure I believe that anymore. I am not sure I believed it then. I think I knew, even as I dialed that number, that I was doing something that could not be undone. I think I knew that the boy's words, repeated by me, would become part of a file that would be used against him. I think I knew that the geometry problem was never the point. I think I knew that the men from Prague did not need my report, but that my report confirmed something they needed confirmed. That the teacher was cooperative, that the school was watching, that the system worked. I have never told anyone this story. Not my husband, not my sister, not my children. I have carried it the way you carry a stone in your pocket. You forget it is there until your hand brushes against it, and then you remember its weight and you put your hand somewhere else. Ondej came to my door in 1996. He was 43 years old. He had a folder under his arm. He asked if he could come in. I said yes. I did not know what was in the folder, but I think I knew. I think I knew the moment I saw his face. But that is the next chapter. That is what happened when he sat down at my kitchen table and opened the folder. I remember the year the meeting stopped being about anything. By 1979, the monthly staff gatherings in the school gymnasium had become a ritual I could perform in my sleep. The director would stand at the podium, a wooden thing with a chipped edge, and read from the party circulars that arrived in brown envelopes. We sat in rows of folding chairs, the same chairs we used for the May Day assembly, and we nodded at the same intervals. I knew exactly when to nod, when he paused to look up, when he said, "The continued vigilance of our teaching staff," when he mentioned the Western media. We all knew. We had been doing it for years. I was promoted to head of the mathematics department in 1983. It came with a salary increase of 300 crowns a month and a new responsibility, writing annual ideological assessments of the teachers under me. I wrote them in my office after the students had gone home, using a fountain pen on official letterhead. I wrote that each teacher demonstrated correct socialist consciousness and active participation in the collective political education of the youth. I wrote that none of them had expressed views contrary to the party line. I wrote these things knowing they were not true of some of them and that the truth would have cost them their jobs. I wrote them anyway because the alternative was to write nothing and explain why. At home, we lived another life. She and I had a small transistor radio, a Tesla model with a cracked dial that we kept in the bathroom. Every evening after dinner, one of us would turn on the tap and the other would tune the radio to Radio Free Europe. The water running was our signal to the neighbors, if they were listening, that we were doing something mundane. We leaned close to the radio, our heads almost touching, and listened to voices from Munich that told us what the newspapers in our own country would not print. I remember the way the light fell in that room, a single bulb above the mirror, the steam from the tap, the two of us in our bathrobes, not speaking, just listening. Colleague I trusted. Her name was Hannah. She taught history, passed me a carbon-copied typescript of Havel's The Power of the Powerless in 1984. She slipped it into my bag during a break between classes, wrapped in a copy of the school newspaper. I read it that night in a single sitting on the floor of the kitchen with the door locked, the pages spread around me. I read about the greengrocer who places the sign saying, "Workers of the world, unite," in his window, not because he believes it, but because everyone does, and not doing it would draw attention. I read about living within a lie. I read about the line between complicity and survival. I hid the typescript behind the washing machine in a gap between the machine and the wall, wrapped in a plastic bag. It stayed there until 1990. Gishi asked me once. It was 1986, a Saturday afternoon in spring. We were sitting in the kitchen, drinking coffee, the window open to the sound of birds. He said it casually, as if he were asking whether I had remembered to buy bread. "Marta, did you ever report anyone?" To the StB, I looked at him. He was not accusing me. He was asking because he wanted to know, because he trusted me, because he thought the answer was no. I said no. I said it without hesitation. He nodded and changed the subject. He believed me. He died in 1993, a heart attack, sudden, in the garden, and I have never told him the truth. I do not know if I would have told him if he had lived longer. I do not know if I would have been brave enough to lose his trust. I do not know. November 1989. I stood in Namosty Svobody with thousands of others. The air was cold, the kind of cold that settles into your bones and stays there. I had a set of keys in my hand, the same keys I had used for years to unlock my classroom, my apartment, the drawer where I kept the ideological assessments. I jangled them with everyone else. The sound was enormous, a metallic roar that filled the square and echoed off the buildings. I felt joy, real joy. The kind that makes your chest ache, and I felt terror because I knew what was coming. I knew the files would open. I knew the archives would be made public. I stood in that crowd, my keys raised, my breath visible in the cold air, and I did not know what was written about me. I did not know if my name was in a ledger somewhere, a single line, a source code, a date. I did not know if I would be named. I did not know if I would be forgiven. I did not know if I deserved to be. I remember the knock, not because it was loud, it was ordinary, a Tuesday afternoon knock, 3 short raps. But I remember the sound of it, the way you remember the sound of a door closing that you know you cannot open again. I was at the kitchen table marking quadratic equations, and I got up and walked to the door and opened it, and there he was. I knew him immediately. The face was older. He was 43, same as me then, but the eyes were the same. The same way of looking at you that made you feel like he was already solving a problem you hadn't finished stating. He said, "Mrs. Boskova?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "I'm Ondej Blajnik. I was in your class, 1976 to 1979. And I said, "Yes." I remember. He asked if he could come in. I stood aside. He walked past me into the hallway, and I closed the door behind him, and the sound of it closing was exactly what I had just thought it would be. He sat at my kitchen table. I made tea. He put the folder on the table between us, closed, his hand resting on it. He told me what he had been doing since 1989. He had retrained. He was running a small software company in Brno, nothing large, but it was his. And he had spent 2 years, off and on, going through the StB files at the archive in Prague, the ones that had been opened. He said it like a confession. I wanted to know who had done what. I needed to know. He opened the folder. He slid the document across the table toward me. He did not turn it around. He said, "I want you to read this." I read it. It was a photocopy of a StB document dated March 1978. Classified as a routine observation report from a cooperative source in the educational sector. The text was typed single-spaced. It contained Ondej's name, his father's name, the detail about the family considering emigration, the detail I had telephoned. At the bottom, a source designation code. I did not recognize the code. He told me the archive had decoded it. It was mine. He said, "I didn't know what it would say when I knocked on your door. I thought maybe you had nothing. I thought maybe I could ask you for a letter, and you would write it, and that would be the end." He paused. "I found out what it said by watching your face." I looked at him. I said, "It was one report." He did not answer. I said, "I did not know what they would do with it." He still did not answer. I said, "I told myself it was nothing." That they already knew everything. That I was not really, he said. "I was 15. I said, "I know." He said, "I scored in the top 3% in mathematics." They gave me a vocational school. I spent 10 years rewiring factory floors. My father never worked as a historian again. He died in 1989 before the revolution. He never knew what I could have been. I said, "I am sorry." He said, "I know." He sat there for a long time. He did not drink his tea. He looked at the document once more, then closed the folder. He stood up. He said, "I came here because I needed a letter. I needed to clear my name for a security clearance. I thought maybe you would write it. I understand now that you cannot." I said, "I could write it anyway." He said, "No. You can't." He picked up his folder and walked out of my kitchen. I heard the front door open. I heard it close. I heard his footsteps on the stairs, then on the pavement, then nothing. I have not heard from him since. I sat at the table for a long time after he left. The tea was cold. The quadratic equations were still half marked. I looked at the chair where he had sat. I thought about what I could have said. I could have told him that I had only done it once, that I had never done it again, that I had not known, that I had been afraid, that everyone was afraid. That fear does not excuse anything. I could have told him that I had never told my husband, that Gigi died in 1993 believing I had never reported anyone, that I let him believe it, that I let him die believing it. I did not tell him any of that. I just sat there and he left. And now I am sitting here telling you. And I still do not know what I would say if he walked through that door again. I do not know if there is a sentence that can hold what I did and what I told myself and what I failed to do afterward. I do not know if I am telling you this because I want to be forgiven or because I have stopped believing that forgiveness is something I am entitled to ask for. I know only that I have carried this for 46 years and I am tired. And I want to put it down somewhere, even if it is only here, even if it is only into a camera that will be watched by people I will never meet. Because the alternative is to carry it to my grave, and that feels like another kind of silence, and I have had enough of those. I remember a Tuesday in the spring of 1990, about 4 months after the Velvet Revolution. I was standing in my classroom on Kounicova Street, the same room I taught in for 17 years, and I was holding a new textbook. The ministry had sent it overnight. Cover was the same shade of blue as the old one, but when I opened it, the word problems about collective farms were gone, replaced by problems about vast timetables and interest rates. I stood there for a long time, just looking at the pages. I thought, this is what it looks like when a system decides to stop lying. And then I thought, but the mathematics was always true. The numbers didn't care who was in power. I have spent the years since 1989 trying to separate what the system gave from what it took. It gave me mathematics. Not just the subject, the way of thinking, the elegance of a proof, the satisfaction of watching a student's face when a difficult concept clicks into place. I loved that. I still love it. It gave Czechoslovakia a literacy rate that was not a lie. By the 1970s, we had near universal basic education, and that was real. Children from villages where the roads were still dirt could sit the same examination as children from Prague. I taught some of those children. Their parents had never finished primary school and they were solving quadratic equations. The system did that. It tracked them, it fed them, it gave them a path. And it also required me to become someone who filed a report on a 15-year-old boy. I do not know how to hold both of those things without one canceling the other. I have tried. I have tried for 19 years, since Ondej stood in my kitchen with that folder. I have tried to say, I was a good teacher. I taught well. I helped children. I was also a coward who made a phone call. Are those two facts allowed to sit next to each other? Or does one of them erase the other? I have not found an answer. I do not think there is one. I think the only honest thing is to hold them both and let them hurt. Since 1989, I have watched the new system arrive. The freedom is real. I do not say that lightly. I have students now who study what they choose, who read what they want, who travel. My niece, my sister's daughter, studied English literature at Charles University. She loved it. She graduated in 1995 with a degree and a debt that will take her 15 years to repay. I paid nothing for my education. Nothing. The state gave it to me and I gave it to my students. That is not nothing. I have watched children from poor villages in Slovakia fall out of the new system entirely. No one tracks them anymore. No one guarantees them a path. They leave school at 14, 15 because their families need the money and there is no committee, no examination, no one to say, you have ability, you will go to gymnasium, we will find a way. That was not perfect, but it was something, and I do not think what we have now is straightforwardly better. Only differently broken. I have not done what I should have done. I have not tried to find Ondej again. I have not submitted a formal acknowledgement to the archive. I have not told my surviving sister. I have not told my children. They are adults now. They have their own lives. I do not know if they would understand or if they would look at me differently. I am telling it now to a camera because I am 66 years old and I have decided that carrying it quietly until I die is also a kind of cowardice. And I have had enough of those. I do not know if the system made me do it or if I made myself do it. I have stopped believing those are different questions. The system was me. I was the system. I was the one who picked up the telephone. I was the one who spoke the words. I was the one who told myself it was nothing. I know that a gifted boy was directed into a smaller life partly because of words I spoke into a telephone on a March evening in 1978. I know that. I will always know that. And I know that the system that asked me to speak those words also taught me long division. Gave me a career. It gave me a pension. It gave me the mathematics that I love. I was educated by it. In every sense of that word.